So, this all started a few months ago. I was out on a weekend hike, nothing too crazy, just a walk through the woods near my house. I'm one of those people who just likes to disappear into nature for a bit to clear my head, you know. I've always loved the calm of the woods, the scent of the earth after a rainstorm, and the quiet, just me and the trees. This particular day was cloudy, not quite raining, but the air was damp, heavy with that sharp, fresh scent. It was one of those overcast afternoons where the light barely filters through the canopy. The path was narrow, winding around thick patches of underbrush, and I remember thinking how lonely it felt. Like I was the only person in the world for a moment. Not in a bad way, but in that peaceful, just me in the world kinda way. I had been walking for a good hour, just letting my mind wander, when I noticed something odd sticking out of the dirt. At first, I thought it was just a piece of old cloth caught in the roots of a tree, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't any normal cloth, it was a banner, rolled up and covered in grime. It didn't look like anything I'd ever seen before. It was a deep, faded red with strange symbols stitched along the edges. There were circles and geometric shapes, patterns that looked vaguely familiar, but I couldn't quite place them. It wasn't something you'd expect to find in the middle of the woods, certainly not in this remote area. At first, I figured someone must have left it behind, maybe some kind of weird art project or a relic of an old camping trip. But there was something about it that felt wrong. Like it had been intentionally hidden. The fabric felt old, weathered, like it had been lying there for ages. Curious, I picked it up. It felt heavier than I expected, and when I unrolled it, the symbols seemed to shift in the light. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I chalked it up to the eerie atmosphere of the place. I didn't think much of it at first, other than it being just an odd, old banner. I threw it over my shoulder and started heading back down the trail. But as I walked, I couldn't shake this nagging feeling. It was like someone was watching me from the shadows. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something, but of course, there was nothing there. Still, it felt off, like I had disturbed something I shouldn't have. When I got back to my car, I folded the banner carefully and tossed it into the trunk. I didn't really know what to do with it, but I figured I'd show a few people later, maybe get some answers. Little did I know, that was the first mistake. And the start of everything that would come next. So, the next few days were normal enough, at least at first. I just went about my usual routine, work, home, sleep. But then the weird stuff started. It was subtle at first, just little things that didn't seem to make sense, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The first sign came when I woke up one morning to find a dead rabbit in my front yard. I live in a small house in a quiet neighborhood, surrounded by trees. It's not the kind of place where dead animals just show up. The rabbit was in the middle of the lawn, its body stiff and lifeless, its eyes wide open in a way that made me feel uneasy. There was no blood around it, just the animal, as if it had dropped from the sky. At first, I thought it was just some freak accident, maybe a predator had gotten to it in the night. But it didn't sit right with me. I mean, why there? Right outside my house. I buried the rabbit quickly, trying to brush it off as just an unfortunate event. But it didn't stop there. Over the next few days, I kept finding more dead animals, squirrels, birds, even a raccoon. All of them just appeared in my yard, each one in a different spot, as if they were deliberately placed there. Each animal was perfectly intact, with no visible injuries or signs of struggle. It was like someone, or something, was sending me a message. And then I started getting strange "It's not yours." Sometimes the notes were just a single word, like danger or watching. I tried to ignore it at first. I mean, who wouldn't? But the notes kept coming. They were becoming more frequent, more intense. I even started noticing a few people at work who I didn't recognize, watching me from the corners of the room, or glancing at me whenever I'd turn my back. It felt like I was being followed, and honestly, it scared the hell out of me. But what could I do? It was just a few weird notes, right? Maybe I was just overthinking it. Then, a few days later, I got a call that changed everything. It was from the police. They wanted to ask me about the banner that I didn't know what to think when I saw the number on my phone. The local police department. I hadn't done anything wrong, at least, not that I knew of, but the way they asked about the banner, it was like they knew something I didn't. Mr. Thompson, the officer's voice came through the phone, steady but with a hint of urgency. We need to talk to you about an item you may have found recently. It's important. I didn't want to get involved in anything that could escalate, so I tried to play it cool. What are you talking about? I don't know anything about any item. There was a pause, just long enough for me to feel the tension building. We've been investigating a series of strange occurrences, Mr. Thompson. You might have something we need to take a look at. That's when I realized they were talking about the banner. I didn't mention it right away. Instead, I lied. I told them I hadn't found anything. But the officer pressed harder, asking if I'd been in the woods recently, if I'd seen anything strange, anything unusual. I finally admitted that I had found something, and I agreed to meet them at the station. When I got to the station, it was clear that this wasn't just some random investigation. There were other officers involved, and they looked worried. They didn't say much, but I could tell they were anxious. The banner I had found wasn't just some random piece of fabric, it was tied to something much bigger, something dangerous. But they weren't the only ones who knew about the banner. That night, I woke up to the sound of someone knocking on my door. Soft, rhythmic knocks, as if they were waiting for me to answer. I got up, heart pounding, but when I peeked through the peephole, no one was there. I opened the door cautiously, but there was nothing outside, just the stillness of the night. Except for one thing. A small envelope was left on my doorstep. No return address, no name. Just my name scribbled on the front in a handwriting that wasn't familiar. Inside was another note, "We know you have it. Return it, or else." I started to feel the weight of the situation pressing down on me. I wasn't just dealing with some weirdos, I was in the middle of something bigger, something that was closing in on me. The next few days were a blur of tension. I couldn't go anywhere without feeling like someone was watching. It wasn't just the notes or the police questioning me, it was the constant sense of being hunted. Every time I left my house, I'd check over my shoulder, half expecting someone to jump out from behind a tree or from a dark alley. It wasn't paranoia, it was real. I could feel eyes on me, even when I was alone. And then, one night, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A car pulled up outside my house. I didn't recognize the vehicle, but I heard the sound of a door slamming shut. I peeked through my curtains and saw two men standing at the edge of my yard. They were wearing dark clothes, moving like they knew what they were doing. One of them, tall, wearing a black jacket and a baseball cap, looked directly at my window. I froze, not daring to move, my heart thudding in my chest. I could feel their gaze even through the glass. They knew I was watching. Then they moved quickly, disappearing into the darkness. But the feeling didn't go away. It lingered, growing heavier, as if something was about to happen. Something terrible. The next day was a blur. My nerves were shot, and every little noise made me jump. I couldn't focus at work, and I definitely couldn't stop thinking about what had happened the night before. I kept replaying the image of those men standing in my yard, staring up at me. I wasn't safe anymore, and the worst part was that I didn't even know who they were. That evening, just as the sun was starting to dip below the horizon, I heard a knock at my door. My heart skipped a beat. I had already stopped answering the door unless it was someone I knew. But this time, I didn't hear the familiar voices of my neighbors. The knock was slow, deliberate. Like they were waiting for me to come out. I looked through the peephole, but there was no one there. My stomach twisted, and I felt that familiar, creeping dread crawl up my spine. I opened the door just a crack, barely enough to see outside. And that's when I noticed something. The banner. It was hanging over the railing of my front porch, like it had been draped there on purpose. No one was around, but it was as if it was waiting for me to find it. I stepped outside, my breath catching in my throat. This was no coincidence. I could feel the weight of whatever was going on pressing down harder than ever. As I reached for the banner, I heard a sound from behind me, a muffled rustling, footsteps in the grass. Before I could react, a figure lunged at me from the shadows. I barely managed to duck, and the person, who I now saw was a man in a dark hoodie, tumbled past me and slammed into the side of my house. I stumbled back, my heart racing, as the man quickly regained his footing. "Give it to me," he snarled, his voice low and aggressive. He reached for the banner, his eyes wild with desperation. I was frozen for a second, unsure of what to do. But then something inside me snapped. I didn't know who this guy was or what he wanted, but I wasn't going down without a fight. I shoved him away with all the strength I had, sending him stumbling back. But he wasn't alone. From the darkness, another man appeared, this one older, with a cold, hard look in his eyes. He was holding something in his hand, what looked like a crowbar. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," the older man said, his voice low but dangerous. "Hand it over, and no one gets hurt." I realized in that moment that this wasn't some random break-in. These guys knew exactly what they were after. And it was the banner. I backed up, my mind racing, trying to figure out what the hell was going on. How did they know? How had they found me? I had no answers, but I knew one thing: I wasn't going to give them the banner. Not without a fight. I turned, running into the house, slamming the door behind me. The two men pounded on the door, shouting for me to open it, but I didn't. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking, and called the police. But as I dialed, I realized something: there was no way I could wait for them to arrive. These guys weren't going to stop. I ran upstairs, grabbed the banner, and threw it in the back of my closet. They were still out there, and I knew they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. But even as I hid inside, something felt off. It was like the world was closing in on me. Every time I moved, every time I thought I was safe, I could feel them out there. Watching. Waiting. The days that followed felt like a constant nightmare. I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I was haunted by the image of those men, those strangers who would stop at nothing to get that banner. But the worst part wasn't the men themselves, it was the feeling that no matter what I did, they were always there, just out of sight, just waiting for me to slip up. I thought about going to the police, about telling them everything I knew. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the police weren't going to help. They were just as clueless as I was. They'd been asking questions, sure, but they didn't know anything. And the more I dug into it, the more I realized they weren't even the ones who had contacted me. The notes kept coming, more and more, each one more urgent than the last. They would be slipped into my bag at work, shoved into the back of my car, even left in my mailbox when I wasn't home. I couldn't get away from them. The messages were always the same: return it, you don't know what you've done, and sometimes, just a single word: help. I knew I was being watched. I could feel it. When I went to the grocery store, I'd catch glimpses of people watching me from across the aisles, their eyes darting away when I made eye contact. I tried to shake the feeling, but it wouldn't go away. I was trapped in this suffocating paranoia, unable to breathe without feeling like someone was right behind me. And then, one day, I found something else. It was another note, but this time, it wasn't left for me. It was addressed to someone else. A small, handwritten letter, but with an official-looking stamp on the back. The letter was from the police. Someone from the station had been involved in this mess, and I didn't know who. I opened it quickly, my hands shaking. It read, "Mr. Thompson. The investigation into the banner has escalated. We advise you to stay where you are and avoid contact with anyone involved. We are handling this, and you are not to attempt any further interaction. Do not attempt to return the banner." It was as if the police were warning me off. It felt like they were telling me to back off, to give up. I couldn't believe it. What was going on? Why were they trying to protect me from returning the banner? I knew then that I couldn't rely on the police. They were part of it. I was alone. The next night, I decided to confront it. I wasn't going to live like this anymore, always hiding, always looking over my shoulder. I was going to end it. I was going to return the damn thing in hope that whatever had been chasing me would finally stop. So, I packed up the banner and drove out to the woods where I had found it. I didn't know what I was expecting, but as I pulled up to the old trail, I felt the weight of what I was about to do. It was like I was stepping into the lion's den, knowing that once I crossed that line, there would be no turning back. I walked down the familiar path, the trees looming over me like silent witnesses to the madness that had overtaken my life. The place where I had found the banner was still the same, quiet, untouched by time. But this time, something was different. The air was thick, heavy with an energy I couldn't explain. I could feel it in my bones. I dug a hole in the dirt, deeper than I thought I would need to. And as I buried the banner, I felt a strange relief, as if I was finally putting an end to all of it. But as I stood up, ready to leave, I felt that old sensation again. Eyes on me. Watching. And I knew, for a fact, that this wasn't over. That I didn't know what I expected when I buried the banner, maybe a sense of finality, some relief, but instead, I just felt more unsettled than ever. The air around me felt thick, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I stood there for a moment, staring down at the freshly dug earth, wondering if this would really be the end of it. But the strange feeling lingered. I didn't look back as I walked away. I couldn't. Something told me if I did, I'd see them, the people who had been after me, who had been watching my every move. But I couldn't let fear control me anymore. I had made my choice. I had buried the banner where I found it, and that was that. The next few days were eerily quiet. The notes stopped coming. I didn't see anyone lurking around my house. For the first time in what felt like forever, I was able to breathe again. The tension, the constant feeling of being hunted, it was gone. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could finally relax, like maybe everything was going to be okay. But even as things seemed to settle down, there was one lingering question in my mind: what was the banner? Why had it been so important? And why had they wanted it back so badly? I tried to forget about it. I really did. I just wanted to move on with my life, get back to normal. But it haunted me. I couldn't shake the thought of what it might mean. Every time I saw a news story or read about a strange disappearance, my mind would go back to that banner. Was it some kind of secret? A symbol of something bigger? But as the weeks went by, I started to forget. The fear, the constant looking over my shoulder, it all faded. My life slowly returned to its regular rhythm. I even managed to put the whole experience behind me, like a bad dream I was happy to wake up from. Then, one day, I decided to stop by a pawn shop. I'd been meaning to clear out some old things I'd been holding onto, and I thought maybe I'd sell some of them. Just as I was walking past the counter, the shop owner, an older guy named Ray, stopped me. "You ever come across anything strange?" he asked, eyeing me with a curious look. "People come in here with all sorts of odd stuff. I remember one time a guy brought in a banner, looked like something from an old secret society. Real fancy, you know. You ever see anything like that?" I froze. It was like time had stopped. A banner. From a secret society. My heart started pounding in my chest as the memory came rushing back, the men chasing me, the notes, the constant pressure to return it. "No," I said, forcing a smile. "Nothing like that." Ray shrugged and went back to his work, but the words echoed in my mind as I left the shop. The banner wasn't just some random object, it had meant something. Maybe it still did. But I didn't care anymore. The experience had broken something inside me, and I knew I could never go back to the life I had before. The mystery was unsolved, and maybe it was better that way. No pawnshop had ever accepted it. They thought it was fake, just another piece of junk. The cops had dropped the case. The men who had been chasing me had disappeared, as if they'd never existed. So here I am. Back to a quiet life. I still think about the banner sometimes, but it's fading from my memory now. I don't want to remember it. I don't want to think about the people who chased me or the dark secrets that banner held. It's behind me now. And that's where I plan to keep it, out of sight, out of mind. I just want to move on. Forget it ever happened. Like a bad dream I was lucky enough to wake up from.